Hey guys! Today I'm sharing how I color these tall vintage houses from Johanna Basford's book. I had already started this page earlier and I actually filmed part of that process in a previous video, so if you're curious, feel free to check it out. I hadn't used purples in a while and this page was kind of calling me to finish it, but I didn't want to pressure myself to film everything step by step. I had a feeling I'd just dive in and keep going until the whole thing was done, which is exactly what happened. If you've seen the final result already, you'll know I added a full background and finished all the houses. And yes, I know it might look a bit overwhelming at first, especially if you're new to coloring, but honestly, it's all about having a few simple ideas to guide you through. Once you get going, it feels much easier than it seems at first glance. You do need a little bit of experience if you're working with paint, but this kind of look can be done with color pencils too, so no fancy tools needed. I started this page using Fuumuui watercolors. I showed that part in the previous video, so I figured it made sense to just keep going with them. They're actually really lovely to use in a coloring book like this. The palette has a nice range, so I didn't have to mix anything, which made the whole process a little easier. That said, I will also be adding some acrylic markers, pencils, and a few other bits here and there, so in the end this turned into a classic mixed media piece, but nothing too complicated, I promise. I'm starting with a watercolor base. Since watercolors can't really be lightened once they're down, it's always best to begin with lighter shades, and you can easily build up depth as you go. Now, this paper isn't really made for watercolor, so I avoid working wet on wet or using too much water. I keep my brush kind of half dry and just add a little water when I need to move the pigment around more evenly. Anytime I start layering watercolor like this, I already know there'll be an ugly face, but that's normal, you just have to trust the process. For this middle house, I'm going with a magenta or dusty rose shade, maybe with a hint of purple. I want it to stand out from the house next to it, but still not be too dark. My plan was to make the side windows a little darker than the one in the middle, but the main thing here is that we're doing a night scene, so I'm turning the lights on in the windows first. You don't have to do it right away or in every window, but I like doing it early and I want the glow to show through all the layers. The easiest way to show light is to add yellow around the window frames first, since the glow spreads onto the walls. You can wait for it to dry before adding more layers, but I'm not too worried about that. I'm just going over it right away with a thin pink-purple wash. You can color each floor or ceiling differently if you want. That part's totally up to you. Just keep in mind, we'll be adding a brick texture later, so the house will end up looking a bit darker in the end anyway. I'm using the US edition of the book, which, at least in my experience, has slightly thicker paper. And this watercolor method works quite well with it. The paper won't wrinkle or bleed through unless you use way too much water. That said, I have to admit, I don't worry about that too much anymore. Sometimes I let a bit of water run or pool in places, and I honestly don't mind if there's a little bleed through. I'd rather enjoy the process on this page than stress about keeping the other side perfect. The more you work with liquid paints, the less those little imperfections will bother you. And when you eventually color the back of the page, most of it will be covered anyway. The only thing that can be a bit annoying is if the paper is too thin and starts to buckle or warp. The best thing you can do is use less water and shorter strokes. Aim to finish things in 1 or 2 light layers. That's why I recommend picking smaller illustrations for watercolor and maybe avoiding full backgrounds, unless the paper is really strong. If you love painting, try to get comfortable with small imperfections. You're coloring in a coloring book. it should be fun and relaxing, not something to stress over. While painting, you'll probably notice how much easier everything gets when you have the right brush shape. For watercolor in books, round brushes are great for details, and a small flat brush like this one comes in really handy for more even areas. If you're working on a background and want it to be smooth, a larger flat brush helps a lot too. When we paint buildings like this, it's honestly pretty hard to get a smooth finish with just a round brush. But if that's all you have, no worries, just try to move the brush up and down in the same direction to keep the strokes consistent. We're going to add a second layer anyway, and that is the brick texture, which will keep super simple, just short little strokes, nothing complicated or overly planned out. And if it doesn't look perfect, don't stress. We're going to go over everything later with a few colored pencils and pull it all together. Just try not to make the bricks too dark. Keep them just a shade darker than your base color. You can add a few darker bricks here and there if you like, just for variation, but it's always better to darken things later than to overdo it too soon. It's much easier to build up than to tone things down once it's too heavy. I'll add shadows wherever I feel they're needed. This page is very detailed and of course mistakes will happen. If you've only turned on the lights in some windows, you might want to be a bit mindful of where the light would hit, but honestly it's not a big deal. Just follow a bit of logic, nothing too strict. I imagined a dark sky above the city with a moonlight glow, and that's kind of the vibe I'm going for. So when I'm placing shadows, I just think about that one light source and let that guide me. Also, I want to mention pages like this, when we're working with a watercolor base, usually go through a few awkward phases, but that's part of the process. It's how I build a scene. It's so much easier to imagine a vibrant night scene once you already have a bit of color down. From there, you can just add details based on what feels right, and suddenly it all comes together. You'll see, now we're just adding finishing touches where needed. Since I like working with a brush, I sometimes try to build up layers of watercolor, but always make sure to do it when the surface is dry. If you try layering while it's still wet, the paper might start breaking down and things can get messy really fast. Same goes for colored pencils. Actually, that can be even worse. If the paper isn't completely dry, the pencil won't glide, it will just sort of scratch the surface and leave the paint in a weird way. So yeah, working with water in a book definitely requires some patience. You have to know when to pause and let things dry before moving on. But the nice thing is, while one part is drying, you can always jump to another area and keep working. That's usually what I do. I sort of walk around the page, layering color in stages. Now for this lower section where the stone road is, that's part of the foreground, so we want to treat it with the same care as the background. If you're painting a larger area here, try to work fairly quickly in one brushstroke direction, and keep in mind that this will also be a process. Paint, dry, then paint again. I'm going for a kind of reflective surface here, like it had just rained. So we'll play around with yellowish and purple tones to mirror the buildings above, almost like the colors are softly reflected on wet stone. As for the third house, I'll go with slightly darker tones again, just to make sure the colors don't blend too much with the ones next to it. I'll paint it in the same way as the others, just with a slightly deeper base. Now I'm just adding a few more layers, mostly to adjust the colors a bit and see what I can improve with the brush. But if you're already happy with how your colors look, that's completely fine. We can move on to the next part. And that's where we'll start hiding some of the black lines from the original line art, just to bring out more light and give everything a softer, more painterly feel. Now I'm going to bring out my Ohuhu acrylic markers. Since I like using lots of different paints, this 24 marker set is more than enough. There are enough options for what we need to do here, adding highlights, covering some lines, and maybe even making a few corrections, like drawing in extra bricks to create an interesting texture on the house. I never worry about coloring everything perfectly or making sure every line is exactly covered. That would take the fun out of it for me. I am the kind of person who enjoys working quickly, even if that sounds weird when you see how many layers I do or how much detail I add in certain spots. I just like the flow of fast movements and switching colors often. But if you're someone who enjoys being precise and taking your time, absolutely do it your way. That's the whole idea behind my tutorials, to maybe inspire you to try something new, not to follow me step by step. So I won't go into listing every single color I use because there are just too many variations. Instead, I like to explain the process, the how and the why behind what I'm doing. It really doesn't matter whether you're using quick drying acrylic markers or more fluid ones. What matters more is that they have good coverage and a brush tip that's thin enough for detailed work. Try to pick a color that's close to your watercolor base, but just a shade lighter, since these areas will be slightly highlighted anyway. Of course, you can do all of this with a brush too. For example, you can use gouache or acrylic paint, or if you don't have anything like that, you could even mix a bit of white gesso or white acrylic with one of the colors you already used. That way you'll get an opaque effect that's strong enough to cover the lines. As for the road, you can see that I'm being pretty bold with watercolors here, maybe even using too much water. But actually that part should be painted very lightly and transparently. If the colors are too strong or heavy, they can easily pull too much attention and make the whole picture feel off balance. And we don't want that. So take your time and try to add colors that feel like they're reflecting the building in front. You don't have to be precise, especially if you've already used a lot of pigment. And remember, it will all look darker once we draw in the stone lines, so step back a little here, use clean, light colors and build them up slowly. There's no need to rush like I do, especially if you're a beginner or if you haven't done larger areas like this before, so don't stress about where your lines end while doing the base. We'll cover all that when we add another layer for the rocks. If that part feels intimidating, you could use watercolor pencils to lightly sketch in the areas first. Then just blend them out with a wet brush, and that way the paper won't suffer as much. And if you want to stick with pure watercolor, just be careful not to overwork it, go slowly, add color in layers, and let it dry well between steps so the paper stays in good shape. We'll start with the background now, which is quite a demanding part. If you're not used to working on large backgrounds, especially when you'll be drawing over them later, it helps to plan how you'll work section by section and see how it develops as you go. If we look at the picture, the upper part is quite empty, and behind the houses there are areas where the background could be a bit lighter. Above that, we'll have a dark night sky. The spaces between the houses also make things easier. They're small enough that it's harder to make big mistakes here. So I'll take a light blue, not too dark, and fill in that part. You can use a slightly larger brush for this, and if you have a round brush, you can gently work in circular motions to give a misty effect, or simply use a flat brush to sweep across the area. Now that we've done that, we're moving on to the trickier part, the larger section of the background. This is where most people run into trouble, especially when working with watercolors. If you thought the earlier parts were challenging, just wait until you put down the first wash of color. You might feel like tearing the page out, but trust me, that's normal. When you're working with watercolors in a book, there are a few important things to keep in mind. On large areas, the paint won't absorb exactly how you want it to, so you have to work in layers. Coloring book paper is usually far from ideal for watercolors, so you'll need to adapt. Plan ahead, work quickly, and be ready to build up several layers. The first one will almost always look a bit rough, but that's just part of the process. It's also smart to have a plan B, something like acrylic markers, acrylic paint, or gouache, so you can cover up any imperfections later. If you have them, don't hesitate to use them. The beauty of mixed media colorings is that almost anything can be fixed. One slightly easier approach I often use for large backgrounds is working with watercolor pencils. They're easier to control and require less water. That's why here I'll combine both watercolor pencils and regular watercolors, because once you add water, they behave in a very similar way. You might notice that I applied the pencils here a bit clumsily, but if you're working only with pencils and you're worried about the background, try to color more evenly and avoid pressing too hard on the paper. That way you won't end up with unwanted lines. Let's start with dark blue, then mix in a little purple if you like, and definitely add some white watercolor pencil as well. It helps the colors glide more smoothly. Try to create some shapes as you go, because once you blend them with the brush, it will be easier to see and control the final look. I've also made the moon much larger than usual because I'm not really into small distant moons. It's far more interesting this way. You can apply a thicker layer of watercolor pencil here, but since I was a bit messy with my coloring, I'm also adding regular watercolor on top. Just make sure you have a brush of the right size so you don't overwork or damage the paper. I started painting from the darker section, but when you get to the clouds, rinse your brush in clean water right away. Otherwise, you'll drag the dark paint into areas meant to be light, like the clouds you marked with white pencil. After rinsing, wipe the brush on a paper towel and use small circular motions to form the cloud shapes. If they don't turn out the first time, don't worry. We can redo them later with stronger colors once everything is dry. And if painting clouds feels intimidating, you can keep it simple. Just use a flat brush to blend your background smoothly from dark blue at the top to lighter blue near the bottom and leave the moon area white. Keep in mind that this is only the first layer. It doesn't need to be perfect. Avoid going over the same wet spot twice, especially on this kind of paper. Work through the area once, let it dry completely, and then we'll add another layer. I always make sure to do a second layer because I like the contrast between lighter colors and a dark night sky. In that second layer, we'll use watercolors to adjust and refine things. Not everything has to be fixed, just enhanced. Add some darker tones in the corners and farther away from the moon, and try to define the clouds a bit more. But make sure to keep the areas around the moon and the sky just above the houses lighter, so the scene keeps its depth and atmosphere. Now that it's dry, you can see the sky still isn't quite right. The clouds need better shaping. This is where we move to the third layer, adding some touches with an acrylic marker, or you can also use acrylic paint or gouache. Back when I didn't have all these options, I just used basic acrylic or even white gesso. If plain white feels too bright, mix in a little blue watercolor to tone it down. There are plenty of ways to add highlights and create softer, more interesting clouds. Making clouds this way is actually quite simple, but it does take a bit of practice. Paint the top edge of the cloud, then blend or smudge the bottom. You can use a brush, your finger, or even a small sponge to dab until you get the shape you like. If you're unsure, work in small sections and don't get stuck chasing perfection. Clouds come in all kinds of shapes, so keep it loose and natural rather than focusing on every tiny detail. And now we're going to start adding a bit more detail to the background. I imagine this house is being part of a Victorian town, so we'll need to create that kind of illusion. Our three houses are the main focus, but adding some faint outlines of tall buildings in the distance will give the feeling of a larger city, maybe even a square behind them. We'll bring it all together with details that might seem complicated at first, but I'll walk you through each step so you can see how to achieve this look. First, because these buildings are far away, they won't have sharp outlines or visible details. We'll start with soft, light, almost transparent shapes. Second, we'll borrow the shapes from Johanna's buildings. It's easier to follow the style of her rooftops while adding your own variations. That way the style stays consistent with the rest of the picture, which keeps the whole scene in harmony. Right now I'm just slightly sketching in the rooftop shapes with a brush. No need to add things like doors or windows, because when you look at buildings in the distance, you usually only notice the silhouettes of their roofs. That makes our job much easier. The goal in this first step is simply to outline the building shapes softly. If the layer looks too light after it dries, you can always darken it a bit, and it's better to build up color than to have to lighten it later. If you're not confident with drawing, you can copy the shapes I'm doing here. Or if you have your own idea, feel free to experiment. I've drawn some quite tall towers and buildings here. They're not perfectly shaped, but that's fine. We can always refine everything later. I'll also add some trees in the darker area behind the house, or at least just enough shapes to give that impression. And that will be enough to complete the background. After that, the only thing left will be to switch on the city lights. Now we need to finish the area in front of the houses. For my taste, it's still a bit too bright. I want it to feel more like a slightly darker street, so I'll add a few deeper shades while also trying to create the impression of reflections on the stone tiles. I'll add some details, but I'm not going to focus on every single stone. This part feels a bit monotonous to me. I don't know what I was thinking when not choosing something simpler, but I do think it works for the picture. I just want to get it done now. I'll also darken the houses a little more so they stand out nicely from the background. Then I'll use acrylic markers to add lights to the buildings behind them. Without going into too much detail, those simple shapes will still give the illusion of a night scene in a lively city. Since the whole page is now colored, this is the point where you decide where to stop and what else you'd like to add. Personally, I enjoy taking my time, stepping back to look at the page from a distance and adding small final touches like stars, shadows, a bit of light on the rooftops. For example, I think the shadows and highlights on the roofs placed in the direction of the moon are important for giving a more realistic feel. Of course, it's impossible to capture every detail perfectly, but that doesn't really matter. The picture is already complete at this stage. One thing that bothered me a little was the emptiness in the foreground, as if something was missing. So I added a small leafy bush on each side. I painted the base with black watercolor, then dotted over it with acrylic markers to create the look of leaves. This helps close the composition and draw the eye back to the houses, which aren't overloaded with details. It also darkens the scene slightly, and I personally like having a bit of black and mystery. I'll finish by reworking some of the details with pencils. Finally, I'll add 2 small finishing touches. In this book, I hide a little girl in a red dress, floating from page to page in a balloon. She's a tiny stand-in for me and a motif I started on the very first page. I don't want to add a full figure here in this tutorial, so I'll tuck a balloon behind the stroller so she peeks out, and I'll place a couple of cats on the page. That's all I need to finish the city scene. I had a wonderful time making this page, and I hope it gave you some ideas for filling the whole coloring page. The trick is to go step by step. Plan a little, work calmly, and you'll often be surprised how much a few small details can bring the scene to life. If you enjoyed this tutorial and want to see more like it, a like or a comment really helps me know I'm on the right track, and it helps me keep creating more for you. Thank you for spending this creative time with me, and I'll see you soon.